So we're just going to wait a little bit for everyone to come in. We are live, so come in, come in. So excited for tonight. We've been doing a lot of work to get here, you guys. Thank you for coming. So just give everyone a little bit of time to show up to this presentation. For all of you guys showing up, just want to say hi to you guys as we begin, giving people some time to come in. All right, so it's about 5 of you guys here, so I think that's a great number to start with. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today. We are going to be having a presentation on behavior analysis on institutional racism in the United States. I am Shamika Pegue. I am the Vice President of Operations here at Stand Up for Equity, as I've been calling it, as we've been calling it, SUFE. So that is who we are. We are SUFE, and I am very excited to be presenting to you guys tonight. This is such a great topic to have such a great discussion on at a time such as this. So please come in, make yourselves comfortable, get you some popcorn, get you something to drink so we can have a really good time. And let's get through this. Just as we're going through the introductions here, I am Shamika, and I am a provisionally licensed behavior analyst here in the state of Missouri. So I am legally authorized and able to speak on a behavioral analytic perspective here on institutional racism tonight. And so I'm really glad to be here. If you don't know, I have my master's in science in applied behavior analysis, and this is what I do every single day. So I am so glad to be able to apply a great science to a subject that is such a grave subject that we're dealing with right now and so present in our world. So thank you guys for showing up, and we're going to get into this. Okay. So we're going to talk about behavior analysis and what it is first, because we're going into a subject that many of you guys may not understand or know, and I want to be your guide with that tonight. So behavior analysis is a natural science, and it seeks to understand the behavior of individuals. Behavior analysts study how biological, pharmacological, and experiential factors influence the behavior of humans and non-human animals. We originally started off as experimental analysis of behavior with Skinner, who is the father of our science. He used to do all these crazy experiments on animals, trying to figure out the principles of behavior that were underlying their contingencies that they were working with in regards to their behavior. So it was a big science and a big field, and he had a lot of students come under him. And some of those students had like a great idea one day to say, hey, this might work on humans. And that is how I came about to be here today, literally standing on the shoulders of giants all the time. So as a behavior analyst, we recognize that behavior is something that individuals do. Behavior analysts, we place special emphasis on studying factors that reliably influence the behavior of individuals. And behavior analysis is this realm of science that studies human learning and behavior. And that human learning and behavior, we believe, comes with a set of rules and principles that have been tested time and time again, and it's something that we are very much into, that we want to explore within the environments and the contingencies that we have been allocated to explore those in. And it comes with these principles that behavior is a product of its environment. Behavior is altered, strengthened, or weakened by its consequences, and whether behavior is punished or reinforced can only be determined by the course that that behavior takes in the future. So currently within our science, we are doing a lot of work specifically with developmental disabilities in regards to to autism-based treatment. We kind of own that field. We are like the gatekeepers of that field in that treatment process. However, we have been branching out into different areas, and some of these areas are concerning social problems such as institutional racism, which is why we're here and what we're discussing. So we're glad to be a part of this, and I'm glad to be bridging our science in this direction because it's definitely needed, and it's something that we really need to talk about. So let's talk about institutional racism in general. Let's get the platform. Let's get our stability in. It has recently gone a restructuring. Racism as a definition has been restructured from the previous Merriam-Webster definition of racism that was previously defined for many years within the dictionary. And according to Hodson 2020, this restructuring recently came from an African-American student who was studying at Mizzou when she was researching and doing some work. And as the recent events that have allowed her to kind of come across this definition, she realized that it did not appropriately take an account into systematic injustice. And as a result, there was this push for Merriam-Webster to be, as a member of their community, as a member of our community, to go in and really help reshape what, racism is. And so they decided to include systematic injustice as that definition. In this regard, we have the National Association of School Psychologists of 2016 gave us, a racism-based, institutional racism-based, definition that we can follow right now. And it means the systematic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white of the dominant race, and the exclusion of people who are of color, racial minority groups. So in this regard, the U.S. has had a history of racially distributed resources and ideas that shape the view of ourselves and the view of others. The U.S. consists of a hierarchical system that comes with a broad range of policies and institutions that keep it in place. And institutions maintain power, privilege, and inequity, which is the framework of systematic injustice, which includes institutions that have come and gone, such as slavery and segregation. If any of you guys are familiar with the separate but equal laws of the Jim Crow era, and of course, reservations and internment camps. So in this regard, what we're going to be exploring tonight is institutional racism is really working on this form of privilege. And that form of privilege comes with a foil to social injustice. And as we're talking about privilege, we're going to be specifically talking about white privilege. Before we continue tonight, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about how we're going to be setting up discussion tonight. This presentation has a longer extended presentation that we're going to be uploading tonight on our website and on our page. That presentation is 2.5 hours long, but due to streaming and our limitations, we're doing an abridged version of this tonight. However, if you are excited and want to learn a little bit more, please do not hesitate once this is over, we get it up tonight, to go to the more lengthier presentation that we've already pre-recorded for you guys, just so you can delve deeper into the subject matter. So I just wanted to throw that in there. We wanted to keep this, a little lighter for streaming purposes, but definitely go check out our more extended version of this video to get more information and to really get into the deeper hearts of the issue, because it's very important and it's very detailed. Okay, so let's go into talking about a social structure. So social structures, this is a term that I came across when I was in sociology working with Dr. Brent Meyer. Shout out to him. He really introduced me to this concept, but the term was coined in the field of sociology, and it really is defined by an organized pattern of social institutions. So now that we know what social institutions are, we have to see that social institutions exist within this umbrella of social structures. And those social structures, they include social institutions and institutionalized relationships that come together and they compose what we come to know as our society. And it can control a person's location in the social structure, their location, their social class, their hierarchy in that structure, the groups that they belong to, the culture in which they belong to. It underlines one's perceptions and their attitudes, and more specifically, their behaviors. So the social structure can guide behaviors. This is kind of why we're here, because we're here to have this behavioral analytic approach to looking at institutional racism here in the U.S. And in this way, social structures, they shape our cultural practices. We're going to get more more into specifics on what cultural practices are, but they're embedded in our social institutions, according to Glenn of 2004. So components of a social structure consisting of social institutions, we have come to know this as controlling agencies in the field of behavior analysis. And this is specifically due to Skinner's work on human behavior, the science of human behavior, where he identifies that the social institutions that sociology had identified previously are just controlling agencies. We're going to look at what a controlling agency is. But he says that they work together to maintain social order by limiting, guiding, and in organizing our human behavior. And again, this is according to Skinner of 1953. I want you guys to take a look at these, 4 terms here at the bottom. They're really important because we're going to be talking about this throughout the entire presentation. But they're association, reinforcement, punishment, shaping, and then modeling and imitation. Some of you guys may be already familiar with these terms. It may not be new to you, but for some of you guys, they may have different connotations, and that's why we're going to break down what these actually mean in the field of behavior analysis. But again, wanting you guys to focus on human behavior here and looking at how controlling agencies work to, again, limit, guide, and organize human behavior. So again, what is an institution? An institution is a system of behavioral relationship patterns that are densely interwoven and enduring, and they function across an entire society. So we already have our umbrella. We have these social structures, and then we have these institutionalized patterns of behavior. And then again, within those institutions, that's how they exist. So when we're talking about this behavioral relationship pattern that has become known as the institution, it has a function. And this was originally defined by Durkheim of 1895. He was one of my favorite sociologists when I was studying him in undergrad. And Emile Durkheim believed that our society, like a well-oiled machine, had its own function, and it had different parts that had their own functions as well. And each part worked together to keep this machine, well-oiled machine, working and running all the time. That emphasis on function is where Skinner comes in, and he has like a strong agreement. He's like, I second that. This is important because controlling agencies have a function in how they're organizing institutions to maintain human behavior. So again, these are agencies that have a strong power on individual behavior, directly influencing human behavior, and they are defined by every single action of the individual who is influenced and influences the environment around them in which they live. So again, we are agents of change ourselves. We can put things into our environment, and our environment can, of course, shape us as well. So similar to Durkheim, Skinner's primary focus was on social institutions and controlling agencies, and the focus was always on function. So it's so important that we talk about function. Function is something that we're going to be enduring, constantly running throughout this entire presentation because function matters. So let's take a look at these institutions. Over here to the left, you have these institutions as they've been defined by sociology, and over to the right, you have these other controlling agencies as they've been defined by Skinner of 1953. So looking at this, we have education, employment, housing, criminal justice, religion, healthcare, human services, and the media. And then we have government and law, education, religion, economics, and then psychotherapy over here for controlling agencies. Regardless of what we are going to call them, we can put those institutions into these controlling agencies. So again, that functional piece is what matters here, not the topography of what they look like and how they're formed, but how they are functioning. So how do institutions implement control? We're talking about the basic principles of behavior. I want you guys to go back to those original definitions that we just ran through. We're going to talk about these as they're relational to the field of behavior analysis. I want to start off with association. Association is just a pairing between stimuli and events that are either respondent, which means they have been elicited from us, or conditioned, operantly conditioned because they've been evoked. In this regard, you could put 2 events together, and because of their presentation, one of them could take on the form of a stimulus control over another. The best way to explain this is through Ivan Pavlov. If you guys have ever taken a psychology course, you probably would have come across Ivan Pavlov and his work with association with respondent conditioning. In this sense, remember, he had this dog and he had a bell and he had some meat that the dog already liked. And he takes this bell, he makes a ding, he presents the meat, and then the dog will salivate. He takes the bell again, pairs it with the meat, the dog will salivate again. He does this over several presentations to the point where he no longer has to present the meat. He could just ring the bell and this dog will be salivating from a conditioned stimulus that he just created. That pairing is what we call in behaviorism respondent conditioning. It's different from operant conditioning because operant conditioning evokes a response based on its consequences. So we have what is known as an antecedent, something that comes into the environment that already exists in the environment, and we are going to use it as a stimulus that prompts our behavior. And then what follows that consequence helps to sustain that behavior in the future, or it helps to suppress that behavior in the future, depending on whether it's, reinforcement, punishment, or extinction. So when we're looking at reinforcement, let's go into it. It is a mechanism in operant conditioning. Again, operant conditioning is evoking a response, and it refers to anything that increases the likelihood that a response will occur again under similar circumstances in the future. I put some examples here. I have some better ones that we'll probably go through here. But positive reinforcement, thinking about this as training, we all have jobs, we all go through training processes. When we initially get the job is how we kind of learn what it is that we're doing when we get this job. So looking at a training example, after completing job training requirements, one is rewarded with an immediate bonus. That is a form of positive reinforcement. That is how we are going to hopefully sustain that behavior in the future. So hopefully under similar circumstances, that person is likely to engage job requirements in the future regarding training because an immediate bonus the last time they did it followed that requirement of that completion. Negative reinforcement, which is not to be confused with punishment. This is something that we always have to talk about in the field of behaviorism. A lot of people get negative reinforcement and punishment mixed in. However, negative reinforcement, it does increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future. However, it works under different contingencies because there's already this present aversive stimulus. And aversive stimulus is something that we just don't like. It's not something that we are fond of. The better example I can give for this is think about your alarm clock. We all have these alarms that get us up first thing in the morning because we have to be at work or we have to be somewhere important. And that nagging response that in your ear early in the morning is an aversive stimulus. And as a result, what we do is we fumble in the dark for our phones. We hurry up and we're like, turn this off. We get it off and the sound is immediately done. The removal of that sound is negative reinforcement. And it hopefully, what it means is if that worked the last time to get your alarm to go off, is likely going to work again in the future, which means you're likely to do that same behavior under that similar circumstance again in the future. The important tenet of reinforcement is that it increases the likelihood of the behavior occurring again in the future. That is different from punishment. Punishment is any event occurring after a given behavioral response reduces the likelihood of that behavior occurring again in the future under similar circumstances. An example that I have here is, again, related to work because it's something that we can all as adults, kind of we have in common. So an example would be failure to show up for work. It gets you fired. And as a result, you are less likely to fail to show up to your next job, the next one that you get. In this regard, punishment suppresses the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future based on the contingencies that have been set before it. So again, negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement increase the likelihood of a behavior occurring again in the future under similar circumstances. Punishment decreases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again under similar circumstances. This is different from extinction, though, because extinction is something on a whole different plane, because what it means is we're just going to withhold reinforcement altogether when you're engaging in certain behavior. With punishment, there is an assumative effect that reinforcement is already playing in the environment, and we're just going to completely remove it as a result of the behavior. These are what we call consequence interventions. Reinforcement, extinction, and punishment are related to consequence. That means that they follow a behavior. This is different from shaping and modeling and imitation because these are antecedent interventions. They precede a behavior. This is what we're going to do before behavior even occurs. And shaping and modeling imitation are teaching procedures. And so if we don't like a behavior in an environment, we're going to teach it a certain way so that we get the behavior and the desired effect that we want. And once it's been taught a certain way, we're then going to keep reinforcing it being implemented that same way again and again and again through reinforcement. So shaping is the reinforcement based on successive approximations to a terminal response or goal. In this regard, I like to use some examples here that are a little bit different. Basketball is my favorite one to use because I'm terrible at it. So when I think about basketball, if I'm trying to shape basketball, getting this orange ball into that hoop that is like 10 feet away from me and like yay high, I want to then start with the first step, which will be like, let's get it, 1 foot in your face. Just throw it 1 foot. And I'll reinforce that. And then my next step will be like, well, let's get it 2 feet in your face. Okay. And I'll reinforce that. Once I reinforce it being 2 feet away from you, I'm no longer going to reinforce that previous step of 1 foot in front of you. We're just going to keep successfully moving until you reach that terminal goal. And that is what shaping is. So here my example is, after so many training sessions, one is only allowed to move forward after taking an exam, passing at 80% or better. Again, that's different from modeling and imitation. We are all familiar with modeling and imitation. It's pretty much like the first ways we learn to do anything, because we're doing it with our parents, right? So in modeling and imitation, a subject provides an example of a behavior that is replicated by another subject. So when training, the trainer shows the trainee how to do a behavior, which is then just replicated by the trainee. A lot of the things we learn, again, are based off of modeling and imitation, okay? All right, so we're getting into this as behavioral analysis. Let's talk about how, using these principles that we just went through together, how we can have an issue and a problem such as this. Let's first look at the first step. The first step is the minority individual becomes commonly paired with aversive stimuli, which elicits fear. Remember association. We were working with Ivan Pavlov. He had this bell. It did this thing where it would ding, and we would present the meat to this dog, and this dog would salivate. Over time, we no longer needed the actual food. We could just make this bell ding, and all of a sudden this dog was salivating off of a bell. That was a pairing. He put two things together so that one took on the stimulus control effects of another. In this regard, the minority individual is commonly paired with aversive stimuli, which elicits fear, according to Skinner 1953. We can condition people to become aversive stimulus by pairing them with something that's already aversive. So looking at step 2, as these pairings persist, the individual becomes a conditioned aversive stimulus and thus becomes an object capable of eliciting a form of fear. And according to Wilson and Thal of 2015, this is accomplished through media's portrayal of the African-American individual as either a criminal or deviant. In this way, we want to talk a little bit about media as a social institution, because media is one of the most powerful social institutions that exist in our culture. I mean, I was on Facebook 25 times today plus, I know. It's had significant control over us. We're constantly digesting something that is media-based. In this way, we are constantly being conditioned to certain, contingencies all the time. In this regard, we're looking at media and how we can just pair criminality to people who are of color, specifically in this specific, presentation, African American people, and even Latino people in these, communities. So when we're looking at media, we have to look at it as an institution of powerful control, and it has significant control in our environments. Thirdly, once these images of African Americans, they become these conditioned aversive stimuli, they arouse what we call in the field of behaviorism emotional reflexes. These emotional reflexes, they can evoke an operant response. Remember when we talked about operant conditioning, it's not eliciting, it's evoking a certain response, and it evokes these responses that we have come to know as behavioral effects. It is related to fear, anxiety, anger, and rage that can result in behaviors such as escape, avoidance, violence, and aggression. So when we're looking at these reflexes and how they can just evoke these operant responses that are related to what we have deemed emotional reflexes, they can either get us out of a situation, they can completely help us to avoid situations, or when we're in a situation where we are feeling like a threat of our life, we increase aggression towards what we perceive as something that is aversive to us. So fourthly, once these behaviors are further sustained by reinforcement procedures and the avoidance of punishment within each of these institutions, we create something that is sustained over time. So once you get these issues, once we get to a place where these effects take place and they're reinforced, they become stronger. We strengthen them in these environments, increasing, again, remember, reinforcement, increasing the likelihood that we'll engage in a similar behavior, even in the future under similar circumstances. Okay, that moves us down to the fifth one. Modeling and imitation and shaping, which again are teaching procedures, they help to perpetuate these behaviors in our culture as they are taught across institution after institution after institution. This becomes known as a cultural practice. All of those mechanisms working together, sustained over time, after a while, we don't have to look at them individually. We can look at them as a package, and that package becomes known as a cultural practice. So once an institution has embedded these mechanisms within its associated organizations, they become, again, a cultural practice. And according to Glenn of 2004, a cultural practice is defined, look at this, cumulative effects of human behavior. We've been doing this for a long time. This reinforcement-based, association-based discrimination, and now it's getting reinforced, and then now it's in every institution. It's just being shaped, and then we're imitating it again and again, again and again, and again and again. That's a cumulative effect on human behavior. And as a result of this learned behavior, it is then further sustained through reinforcement and punishment again and again and again. So reinforcement, punishment, and extinction, these are consequence interventions because they always follow a behavior. They help to sustain the behavior, or they help to suppress a behavior, or they completely withhold reinforcement altogether. It is through the use of this operant selection an individual's behavior becomes sustained through its consequences. When something works for us, we continue to do it again because it worked. It was effective. I'm not going to deviate from what's easy and practical to do. We continue to do it. So once something is becoming sustained in the environment, is commonly reinforced, it will take on a life of its own and continue to be engaged because it works. So in this case, this results in neither an increase or decreased likelihood of occurrence of this behavior in the future, according to Glenn of 2004. So cultural practices, they are maintained by the social environment of the individual through one's consequences. We are part of our own social environments. We all belong to different communities, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the social environment includes the individuals that sustain the status quo of an institution. Once I become a member that is reinforcing other members of my community, I can then sustain what has already been happening for years and years, creating a behavioral history within these organizations. So these individuals, they can either reinforce behavior or they can punish behavior according to the embedded behavioral history that is within a particular institution or system. And that happens within the organization, which is involved in the institution, which is structured under the social structure itself. So cultural practices are strengthened and they are maintained within the individual's community, according to Glenn of 2004. So when we're getting into this cultural practices, we have to dig deeper. We have to really get into what this means. So cultural practices, again, they are strengthened and maintained within an individual's community, according to Glenn of 2004. That is what we know because we see it every single day. There's a cultural practice happening around us. In this regard, how does something become a part of a community? I want to talk about verbal behavior. This is something that's in school, child, this was hard, because it was something new for me coming from the field of psychology and going to behaviorism, completely new subject matter, but it was so important to understand how our verbal behavior, our language is mediated through other people and how it can become sustained in our communities. So verbal behavior is specific to an individual's verbal community, which sustains a cultural practice through reinforcement. This is according to Skinner of 1987. I want to talk about verbal communities because it's important to understand that verbal communities sustain verbal behavior. In everyone's verbal community, there's similar verbal behavior. A verbal community engages similar verbal behavior. That's how they became that community in the first place. I'm a part of a verbal community. My verbal community is all of these behavior analysts that when we come to conventions, we all come together and we all are talking in our jargon. I mean, you should hear it. There's behavioral momentum theory being discussed over here. There's schedules of reinforcement reinforcement being discussed over here. There's cumulative effects over here. We're talking so much about punishment and negative reinforcement here and extinction practices. And did you put that on a VI1 schedule too? We are a part of our own community, and we can have conversation that has nothing to do with the outside people who are not a part of our community. We have specific verbal behavior. And then we'll talk about verbal behavior. It's about language that has a function. Again, function just interwoven throughout this entire presentation. It is where a listener can mediate the request of a speaker. I kind of, do an example here while one of our members, the VP of development, I'm always like, running through this presentation. I'm like, oh my God, Sam, I have this cup and I'm so thirsty. And I can just hand Sam, my cup, and he'll be like, you want some water? Yeah, I want some water. He'll take that cup, go fill it up with some water and bring it back to me. And I can have this good water, right? Like, thank God, right? Because I was so thirsty. That is, in that way, I am the speaker and Sam is the listener. And he can be my listener and he can mediate the request that I made. I made a request for water. Another term for mediate here is reinforcement. He can reinforce my request by carrying it through and bringing me what I, put on him as a demand. This is how language works in our communities, in our verbal communities. This is how it is sustained. In this regard, language has a function. It is allowing us to not only just communicate, but to act on our environment so that we can change our environment. In this regard, we have to talk about relational framing and rule-governed behavior within an individual's community because it is helping us to sustain practices that are cultural within these institutions, according to Bigland in 1995. Me and my supervisor today were just talking about rule-governed behavior, and I find it so ironic because I never thought that I would have that come right up against the presentation on it, which is crazy to me. But anyway, going back to relational frame theory. Relational frame theory suggests that language, when placed in a specific contextual environment, it forms a relationship to various stimuli and events that are around it, creating an association between them, regardless of whether or not these events are similar or dissimilar. This can result in what we call derived stimulus functions. In this way, our language, it takes on a different association based on when it's occurring, and what is around it at the time. And it takes on the function of what is being discussed around it or what is happening around it. So it's so important that we talk about context when we are talking about our language because it helps us to create a relational framework in relationships, specifically in association to our verbal behavior and how we are talking and how we're using language. So when we talk about derived stimulus functions, we're saying that there's a lot of associations here that are building higher ordering relationships that allow us to take our verbal behavior beyond just mere association, but building it into what we call stimulus equivalence, which we're going to talk about. And we can now create a relationship to people and aversive behaviors. So you end up with something like this, in which we have aversive characteristics commonly being associated with African-American citizens, according to Bigland in 1995. So you have to remember in this space, language has a function. We do not speak or engage language for language's sake. It's not because it's pretty. It's because it functions. It helps us to get into our environment. It helps us to change our environment so that we can get what we need from it. In this regard, relational framing is the mechanism behind what we have come to understand as prejudice and unjust beliefs within a cultural practice, according to Bigland in 1995. So as we're talking about cultural practice, we're talking about how does this work? These associations, which originally were so simple, small associations, they become prejudice just because of how we're framing our relationships to our words and our associations based on that. I want to talk about stimulus equivalence here. So RFT, it supports the use of derived transitive stimulus relations and functions within our language, right? How it does that is through stimulus equivalence. This is the exact example that I learned from school, and it still is a good example for stimulus equivalence. I use it all the time. So in Cooper et al. 2007, they give you an example of stimulus equivalence as a stop sign, a stoplight, and a cop holding his hand out, kind of telling you to hold up, And even though those three things, topographically, Topographically, they are different. They do not look the same. They have really hardly any attributes that make them similar. I mean, really. However, they have a similar function because they evoke a similar responding in the environment. We naturally make associations among stimuli in our environment daily since we were born. So, relational frame theory supports this higher ordering of stimulus equivalence and association with the help of our verbal behavior. Because, again, the only thing that made the stop sign, that stoplight, and that cop holding his hand out functional, having a functional relationship, is the response that's given to it because we ended up stopping. So again, verbal behavior, like any other behavior, is working under those contingencies of those consequence functions. So again, relational frame theory supports a higher functioning of stimulus equivalence as it relates to our verbal behavior, our functional language skills. An example of this, and it's so important we talk about stimulus equivalence because stimulus equivalence is how we beget stimulus generalization. It's how we can look at something and go, well, all these things are kind of the same. It's an important skill to have. However, what kills it is when we can make these generalizations that can become harmful to minority communities and any other communities that exist around us. So stimulus equivalence becomes stimulus generalization real quick, which is a problem in this case. So I want you guys to look at A equals B, B equals C. So A must equal C, right? A, in the media, Black men are consistently arrested in public. We see it. A equals B. Those Black men that we see in those scenarios are associated with criminals and deviants. B equals C. Those Black men that we see in these scenarios are associated with criminals and deviants. So all Black men and people are criminals and deviants. A equals C. Black men are consistently arrested in public and in the media. All Black men and people are criminals and deviants. Because of our higher ordering function with stimulus equivalence, we can just start skipping through steps and we're able to make a derived transitive stimulus relationship. If you see this little dog in the corner, this is pretty much what it looks like. We're making an association between this image, between the spoken word dog and the spelled out word DOG. And over time, we can go back and forth and derive relationships based on the stimulus alone. And that's pretty much what's happening here. And what we do, eventually, we create a generalization as a result. And that generalization becomes known as what we see as prejudice. So once it's established, it then becomes maintained within an institution through cultural practices. It becomes sustained by the reinforcement, that punishment, and is continually taught through shaping and modeling and imitation. Rule governed behavior. Again, me and my supervisor were candidly talking about this today because we were talking about one of our coworkers having a really solid, good, rule governed behavior. They don't do anything that's not by the books. It could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. However, rule governed behavior is behavior that is a result of stated written consequences, instructions, rules that are not due to contingencies that are experienced in our natural environments. So the way that we normally learn, we learn by experiencing something. And based off of the consequence of that thing, we either continue to do it through reinforcement or we go, that wasn't a really good experience for me last time because of punishment. I don't think I'm going to do it again. It didn't really work in my favor. In this regard, rule governed behavior just X's all of that out. It says, this is a rule, follow it. And then you go on about your life. So we look at this as a verbal antecedent. An antecedent is anything that precedes a behavior. Instructions are antecedent interventions. As these instructions are put into play, we then create what is rule-governed behavior. It's so important because a lot of our behavior is rule-governed. We don't want to experience every single thing to learn from it. Sometimes it's okay to see other contingencies at play, to see someone else experience it, and we learn it as a rule for ourselves. Because again, we're able to make associations and those connections really early since the day we were born. In this way, when we're looking at rule-governed behavior as it works within the criminal justice system, we can look at this as an example in which superiors instruct the individual to follow certain protocols, maintain a strong presence in a minority-based neighborhood, and to maintain and practice hypervigilance when one encounters an individual who poses what we see as commonly in our media as a threat. Now, this officer who is new, fresh out the academy, may not need to experience the contingencies that are related to that, and he probably won't because he's just following orders. That is a rule that is within his department that his superiors gave to him. He doesn't need to experience the contingencies. For a lot of the times, rule governed behavior is great because it's an evolutionary thing that we kind of picked up so that we don't have to experience every single thing that could be to our detriment, but we can just follow a rule after some people have experienced it to understand the outcome. However, when it becomes a part of an institution where nothing gets questioned and rule governed behavior just does go along with the status quo, we end up doing a poor disservice to our communities, especially those communities that are considered a threat. I want to go in here and get into our bread and butter tonight. This is the meat and the potatoes. This is why we all showed up, right? Before we get into this, I know a lot of us are here because the recent events over this summer kind of prompted us to learn a little bit more about our communities. And we wanted to get into how we make this change. How do we stop this madness, right? And that's why we're here. However, it's important to know that this isn't new. This has been going on for years, decades. Unfortunately, for people of color coming from my community, the African American community, this has been something our ancestors have struggled with, and it has just been continually passed down from generation to generation. And now it's on our back. It's our struggle. So this isn't new. And to prove to you that it isn't new, I pulled up some statistics here just so we can get an understanding of what it is that we're really talking about. Here we're discussing police brutality, racial profiling, and mass incarceration. These are the things, the big three that I see as problematic within the African American community because it is where we struggle with high instances of policing, over policing practices. African American citizens are incarcerated at a much higher rate than our non-colored counterparts, according to the NAACP of 2017. And in this framework, African Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of Caucasian Americans. And in 2014, African Americans were comprised 2.3 million of our nation's 6.3 incarcerated individuals within the prison population. African Americans accounted for approximately 36% of the nation's prison population overall, but yet we only comprise 15% of the country's population. Make it make sense. And 1 in 3 African American men are likely to be imprisoned in his lifetime in comparison to 1 in 17 white American men, according to the American Civil Liberties Union. So when we look at this, we're starting to see there are some problems here with legislation and law enforcement practices, again, cultural practices that are unfortunately at the heart of this issue. I want to get into these definitions real quick. We won't stay long on them because, again, just to get you familiarized with what we're talking about. Racial profiling is the use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone of having committed an offense, Ward of 2001. Again, racial profiling occurs when law enforcement stop and they pull individuals over who are perceived as a threat, as in showing an increased likelihood of committing a criminal act. And according to the Sentencing Project of 2014, African American communities are frequent targets of random stops and searches that are likely to lead to an arrest. And research conducted by Harrison 99, then replicated by Warder 2001, in the state of Ohio, again indicated that African American drivers were twice as likely to get pulled over as their Caucasian counterparts. And then this leads us to police brutality. What is the definition here? A civil rights violation where officers exercise undue or excessive force against a subject. This includes, but is not limited to, physical and verbal harassment, physical or mental injury, property damage, and death. So this is what we're talking about and how this can just then lead to mass incarceration. It just refers to, again, that prison boom beginning in the 1970s, resulting in an increased influx of individuals into the penal system in what we call en masse. And this, of course, has led to a strong impact on African American communities. Again, it's important for you guys to understand we're not looking at this as just numbers. These are not just statistics. These are real people with real lives, with real families. And so we have to get into the heart of this issue because it affects a real community. So imprisonment of African American men can cause a separation of fathers from their families, especially their children, according to Imprisoning America 2005. Mass incarceration reduces the rate of marriages within these communities, and it limits the potential for fathers to live and raise their children from their home environment. Mass incarceration can then limit support and family ties needed for rehabilitation, and mass incarceration can affect the employability of previous offenders, resulting in extinction of employment behaviors, leading one back to crime. We're talking here today. Again, we have this controlling agency, government and law, according to Skinner. He states that government and law helps to establish codes of order and justice, which maintain the safety of the governed, protect property, and ensure the overall order. That's what is at its premise. He says, but many of the interests served are those of the powerful through the use of control and punishment. Again, punishment being the key here. And individuals who are perceived as a threat, remember that term, a threat to these interests, become the primary targets of the controlling agency of the government here at heart, according to Skinner of 1953. This is in 1953, Skinner writes this. And here we are, 2021. We have to take into account these traditional formulations, because the argument here is that, well, these are individuals, and these individuals are responsible for their own behavior, for their own, illegal, criminality, and this is why this is happening to them. However, as we look at these, statistics, we see again with, African American community, that increased likelihood of incarceration, making up 36% of the prison population, yet we're only making up 15%. It doesn't necessarily allow the traditional formulation to play out, as when we look at individual conceptualizations, it doesn't take into account that cause and effect of the system as a whole, according to Skinner in 1953. So here we have to ask the question, well, what is the function associated with these consequences? And so it's important that we examine this from a behavior analytic perspective, looking at form and looking at function over form, instead of just looking at the numbers themselves and or looking at the premise of who is the responsible agent. So in this regard, we're looking at an institution. We're looking at systematic criminal justice discrimination, which is the best way that I can kind of put it together here. So in this way, we're going to break these steps down again, specifically according to this social problem of the criminal justice system. So step one, do you guys remember it? Association. This is this idea of this common criminal, and that idea of that common criminal is related to the body of a Black person. We know this because it has been ingrained through media. It has conditioned us to perceive Black people as averse stimuli, eliciting fear responses in an operant response that is maintained through reinforcement and punishment consistently. And so in this regard, we have these things called shows that we like to watch, these criminal law shows such as Cops, The First 48, and television dramas. They help us to sustain this belief, to sustain this association through this prejudice by consistently conditioning us and reinforcing that conditioning that supports that Black people are a racial threat to our society. I hate to say this, like even as an African American person, I consume a lot of these shows. In my family, The First 48 is played everywhere in every house within my family. So this is not something that, just, white America's eating up. African American communities eat it up too, even when we know that these shows target us as the criminals, as the perceived threat. So in this question we ask, how can this relate to negative reinforcement? Well, it relates because this kind of conditioning, this association, is related to escape and avoidance. If there's criminals around me that I see in the media and I know what they look like, I'm not going to go want to be associated with those people. I'm going to fear those people. I'm going to want to escape those people and avoid the spaces that they are in. Again, creating a negative reinforcing relationship. So still on a association, we get this idea of this common criminal is the body of a Black person. The racial threat perspective that is, filtered through the research of Wilson et al. In 2015 states that the views of the criminal law, the criminal justice system, and the sanctions that are meted out by that system as tools used to control racial and ethnic minority groups that pose a threat to the positions and safety of those in power. So we see that this person is considered a racial threat, and we have conditioned ourselves to seeing that association again and again, and that perspective supports, that's just a biologically flawed individual. And actually, these are all biologically flawed individuals that we see. And then we know we go on to make grand generalizations about that group of people later on. So in this regard, Black men, Black people in general are considered the racial threat. I'm going to go here now, and I'm going to ask Sam to go ahead and play for you guys A Birth of a Nation, and let him take this over. Thank you, Sam. All right, you guys, give us 1 second. He's pulling up the video. But I hope you guys are enjoying the presentation so far. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. It really means a lot to us. We are definitely excited about the things that we're getting ready to do. So just give us a couple of minutes to get you guys this clip. And I think we're here.
Is considered to be the birth of the American film industry. It's hard to overstate the impact that this film had both on the medium of film itself and on culture as a whole. The film was responsible for some major leaps in film technology, including the first scene shot at night by use of phosphorus lamp, along with new developments in editing technique and camera movements. But culturally, however, the film carries somewhat of a darker legacy. Even in 1915, the film was met with controversy, showing that the films were protested by the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People for its portrayal of black people. Executive Secretary of the NAACP, Mary Childs Nerney, wrote, "The harm that it is doing to coloured people cannot be estimated. I hear echoes of it everywhere I go, and I have no doubt that this was in the mind of the people who are producing it." The film's portrayal of black people was so terrible that it was still being used as a recruitment tool for the Ku Klux Klan as late as the 1970s. With a runtime of just over 3 hours, the film is split into two halves, separated by an intermission. The first half is set at the outbreak of the Civil War. It follows two families, the Northern Stonemans and the Southern Camerons. It shows us their intertwined lives as they fight throughout the war. It's filled with spectacular battle scenes and ends with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and a defeated South having to face harsh treatment at the hands of a victorious North. The second half of the film focuses on the reconstruction of the South after the war and the glorious origin of the film's supposed heroes, the Ku Klux Klan. The film shows South Carolina just after the war being occupied by black Union soldiers who push white people off sidewalks and are sexually aggressive towards white women. In one scene, a young white girl jumps to her death to avoid being pursued by a black man who is looking to force her into marriage. Black supremacists rig an election by intimidating white voters and stuffing ballot boxes, and the newly elected black legislators are depicted barefoot in the State House of Representatives, drinking whiskey and eating fried chicken. Meanwhile, our hero, Ben Cameron, sees a group of white children putting on sheets to pretend to be ghosts in order to scare black children, and is inspired to form the Klan to fight back. By the end of the film, the Klan regain control of their town from the black oppressors, and on the next election day, they form a line to intimidate black voters and finally restore power. Despite the film's overall message of overt racism, it was still incredibly popular. It remained the highest grossing movie of all time until it was replaced by Gone with the Wind in 1939. It was even the first film to be shown in the White House to President Woodrow Wilson. On a technical level, the film surpassed anything else that came before it. By making use of new editing techniques like parallel editing, cutting between two different scenes that were happening at the same time, the film managed to show a huge scope of story, cutting from the battleground to families praying at home and then back to the battle. This wasn't just something that was happening to a small group of people, this was happening to the whole country. Griffith found new uses for close-ups, cutting tight to an actor's face to show their emotion, lending depth and pathos to the acting. With clever editing and camera work, Griffith managed to make a few hundred extras look like an army of thousands for epic battle scenes. By moving the cameras around the battleground, Griffith was able to produce a sense of space that seemed to span for miles, and his pioneering use of long panoramic shots lent a sense of scale to the action that audiences had never seen before, and helped cement the film's enduring popularity. As well as technical innovations, Griffith also brought innovations to story and narrative. Unlike the films which preceded it, Birth of a Nation told multiple stories at once. Cross-cutting told the audience how one event affected multiple people, and the first use of flashbacks gave context to story. The whole film tied interweaving narratives into one rousing climax in a way that had never been done in film before. Birth of a Nation changed film history, and also set the template for the modern motion picture. Griffith was able to produce epic battle sequences unlike anything people had ever seen before. His use of close-up and intermixed narrative produced powerful drama that captured the audience. It showed a generation of filmmakers what was possible to capture on film, that you could tell grand stories on an epic scale. And it remains to this day one of the most influential films ever made. But its overall message is one of racial bigotry, in which black people are painted not just as lazy and unintelligent, but also as criminals who sexually assault women. So what do you think? Can you call a movie bad just because its message and implications are morally abhorrent? Or is it the technical skill within a film, its beauty, and the talent and artistry that went into it that's more important? How should we view Birth of a Nation today? Let me know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe as we travel through the history of film together.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, Birth of a Nation has some really significant issues with it. Prior to this film coming to life, the KKK never once burned torches in people's yards, in their backyards. After this video, after this movie was produced and after it was filmed and it hit the mass media market, they actually took on the practice of burning crosses in people's yards. Before this, never was even a thing. When we talk about media, we talk about the influence of pop culture. This is what we're saying. This is it. This association is so grand. It's so powerful that it can create new relationships that never once even existed before. So institutional racism, we're going back here again with this associations become prejudice. We just talked about relational frame theory, supporting the use of, derived transitive relationships and functions in our language. Remember, A equals B, B equals C, so we can just jump from A to C. And then this becomes a prejudice belief. It's that belief that is connected to the skill of stimulus equivalence and associations that are constantly being reinforced in one's verbal communities. We all have our different verbal communities. In the African American community, that's its own verbal community. White American communities, that's its own verbal community. So again, things are being reinforced in those communities that we may or may not want to see played out in the general public. And in these associations that are based in stimulus equivalence, they become a part of our, larger verbal behavior, becoming what, people in the psychology field call an internalized belief system. So again, step 3, prejudice becomes this cultural practice, right? We talked about cultural practices, and these mechanisms of modeling and imitation, shaping and reinforcement and punishment. Now we have this belief system. It is now culturally practiced in these institutions, and it's maintained through these mechanisms. So here's an example of how this can happen. We have senior staff mentors and supervisors. They're training these incoming officers to identify criminals and how to target criminals in neighborhoods in which crime is more likely to occur. That is a form of modeling and imitation. I'm just picking up, what you tell me to do here. There's a lot of rule governed behavior in that, but I'm also just imitating what's being modeled for me. Officers are then reinforced through public praise from supervisors, from meeting quotas, and being tough on crime. We hear a lot of tough on crime in our politics. So again, officers that are being reinforced for those practices, it's very significant praise. It's very significant reinforcement. And of course, we get, reinforcement from monetary values as well. Monetary reinforcers, money, bonuses. They're going to be offered when an officer consistently follows specific training and engagement with the public. Again, that rule governed behavior. Do what we told you to do. And it makes arrests will make arrests supporting on that focus of a unit or his or her higher ups and governmental officials, that have a certain agenda to, whether that be increasing, the prison population, or because they're getting kickbacks from it or whatever. They're reinforcing this effect within their communities. And so you look at this, we talked a lot about, but there's good cops, there's people who are going to stand up. There's the whistleblowers. These are the, these soldiers of good, right? Yeah. That's really hard for them to go against that grain, because going against this, system's effect, this institution, it can leave you holding a lot of punishment in the end, where you become ostracized by your unit. You lack the protection from your unit. Poor performance, reviews from your supervisor and your senior staff. You're just not doing good. You're not doing what we tell you to do. You're not following the procedures and the policies. And there's a loss of departmental friends and brothers because you're not going along with the status quo. And there's a potential loss of your job and your career as a cop. Put yourself in those shoes. What if this is all you ever wanted to do? What is everything that you ever wanted? And now, because you're wanting to go against the grain, you're holding all of this punishing effect, and it's taking, an impersonal toll on your life. So you have to be honest with ourselves. Do we think it's easy to withstand this kind of punishment? If this is all you know, if this is all you love, and we have to be honest about that. For you, some of you guys, I would love for you guys to go and, review the Crack documentary that's on Netflix. There's an officer there who was taking drugs from drug dealers, and then he was reselling the drugs. And of course, he eventually gets caught, and he's in court, in front of this judge. And the judge asked him, why did nobody in your unit tell on you? And he looks behind him at his unit. He's like, do you think my brothers are going to tell on me? Well, if you see what happens as a result of telling, this punishing effect, would you tell on him? The likely answer is, oh, hell no. Who wants to hold this bag at the end of the day? So that moves us to step 4. Cultural practices become institutionalized laws. Well, we're already doing this. So we should be putting this into implementation. And the law then becomes a controlling agent that maintains these practices through the institutionalization of the laws. And this becomes just another form of rule governed behavior. You got to remember what Skinner has given us. He's given us, these practices, these mechanisms that are occurring in behaviorism all the time. When we look at our own behavior, this is occurring. So we have what now becomes established rule governed behavior through our laws. We're going to look at a video here on stop and frisk law, but I want to talk to you about what stop and frisk law is. It's stop, question, and frisk. It's NYPD policy, whereas the police can just detain and question pedestrians and potentially search them if they have a reasonable suspicion that the pedestrian in question is committing or is about to commit a felony or penal law misdemeanor. What does it sound like to you guys? Because it sounds a lot like racial profiling, because it is. A reasonable suspicion is not enough to pull some random person over and accost them. But it became a practice of law because racial profiling had become so heavily attacked. Unfortunately, the victim here is Khalif Broader. He is the most famed victim, the poster child for against this law and for the prison reform that we currently are seeing right now within the criminal justice system. And his case is pivotal in closing portions of Rikers Island's prison. I'm going to throw this back over to Sam, and he's going to present for us on this specific topic. Thank you, Sam. He's going to present the video. Here at Stand Up for Equity, we are very proud to be a player in counterculture, this kind of educational reform, doing these videos, and of course our bigger agenda, which is to lobby for reform at the legislative level, is why we're here. It's what we're aiming to do. This is our goal. So very proud here at SUFE to be a part of counterculture. Very proud. So thank you guys for coming to this. We are very pleased to have our panelist discussion on February 11th at 7 p.m. We want you guys to come and attend that too. There'll be another presentation for us. And of course, you can follow us at Stand Up for Equity. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at official SUFE. And you can check out our website at www.standupforequity.org to find out how you can sign up to be a volunteer or just make a donation to support us. These donations are going to be really helpful in getting us off the ground and doing some more work in our communities. And it's going directly to help people to create more, equitable opportunities for individuals in these communities. And we're very much dedicated to that work. So we want to thank you guys for coming. If you want to see the more extended 2.5 hour long presentation on this, it will definitely be up very soon on our site, on our actual website, and here on our Facebook page. So you can stick around to watch that if you're interested in it. But again, remind you guys of our panelist discussion, but you can also stick around right after this because we are going to be doing a live where we're going to answer any questions that you may have about this presentation. If you have questions for our panelists for February the 11th, we're going to take them down right now. And we're going to answer them for you preliminarily, and we're going to let them have their take on it as well. But with all of this, we just want to thank you guys for this discussion, and we really want you guys to remember, in all ways, all days, forever and ever, Black lives really do matter. Thank you for coming out. Okay, so for those of you guys who are sticking around, I want to introduce our team. For those who have been with me for this last hour or so more, I am Shamika Pegue, and I am the VP, the Vice President of Operations here at SUFE. I want to go right into introducing our CEO. His name is John Connor here at SUFE, and then going to spin it right back over here to Quizante Falls, our Vice President of Marketing. And Samuel Pummel, who we need to death, y'all, Vice President of Development, and our lovely Micah Jeffries, Vice President of Communications. And we're all very happy to be here as Stand Up for Equity, and we are SUFE, you guys. So thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. If there's anybody, is there any questions? We would like to take them. If you have anything, is there anything in the chats? What's happening?
Okay, so it doesn't look like
Bima says hi.
Bima
said hi. Hey, Bima. Hey, Bima. That's my sister. For y'all who don't know.
Thank you, Maya.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah,
this
for sure.
was a really great first event for us. Really excited by the turnout. And please follow us on social media so you can keep up to date with what's going on.
All of the social media.
All of our social media.
All of the social media.
All right, guys. Well, if we have no questions, I think we should wrap this up. Again.
Right. Thank you guys for coming.
Yeah.